Hello, I'm Tony Collins and this is the Rugby Reloaded podcast. This week we're going to look at how Rugby League was born in France. And to know how that happened, I'm going to talk a little bit about how rugby itself began in France. Rugby came to France in the 1880s as a game of the French elite who looked to Britain for inspiration. One of its greatest early supporters was Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympic Games, who also refereed French rugby's first ever championship final in 1892. But just as in Britain, rugby quickly became a symbol of local and regional rivalry, especially between the Southwest and Paris. It also became very popular amongst all classes. By 1914, huge crowds gathered for big matches, and every town and village in the southwest of France had a club. So in the 1920s, French rugby had started to look a lot like rugby in the north of England or Australia before it had split into league and union. In the early 1930s, there was even speculation that the French Rugby Union, the FFR, might open discussions with the Rugby Football League after the French had been kicked out of the Five Nations for violent play in 1931. But the French Rugby Union went in the opposite direction and set up the International Federation of Amateur Rugby in January 1934 as its own rival organisation to Rugby Union's International Board. However, in early 1933, the Rugby Football League was contacted by two journalists from the French daily sports newspaper L'Auto, the forerunner of today's L'Équipe, about the possibility of starting rugby league in France. The RFL already had good contacts in France, partially through the cycling links of RFL Secretary John Wilson, who had ridden for Britain at the 1912 Olympics and who knew Victor Breyer, the editor of the prestigious Parisian sports newspaper Echo des Sports. After months of negotiations, on the 31st of December 1933, the touring Australian Kangaroos met an England side on a snow-covered pitch in an exhibition match played at Paris's Stade Pershing, sponsored by Echo des Sports. The response of the crowd was ecstatic. Kangaroo captain Dave Brown was carried shoulder-high from the field by spectators, and the French press expressed amazement at the skills of the players of what they called neo-rugby. 2 days later, France's great international forward Jean Galia, who had earlier been suspended by the French Rugby Union for allegedly offering money to players to join his club at Villeneuve, signed an agreement with the RFL for a French team to visit England in the spring of 1934. French Rugby League was born. Galia's team arrived in England in March to play against 6 clubs. The 17 players in the touring party had 40 international rugby union caps between them, and despite never having played rugby league before, they acquitted themselves well, even managing one win against Hull. Support poured in across France for the new rugby. Everyone agreed that it was faster, more skillful and less violent than the attritional forward-based game that had come to characterise French Rugby Union. And League also had one great advantage that French Rugby Union did not: top-class international rugby against England. For French rugby, driven by the tension between its Anglophile origins and its Anglophobe instincts, there was always an overriding compulsion to test itself against the British, and especially the English. Galia, who had played in France's first ever rugby union wins over England and Wales, understood this perhaps better than anyone. On the 15th of April 1934, a week after the Ligue Française de Rugby à 13 was founded, France hosted England at Paris's Stade Buffalo. 20,000 Parisians turned out to see a star-studded England side overcome Galia's men 32 points to 21. Defeated but not disgraced, it was clear to everyone at the match that France had a future in the new game. The following season, England were held to a 15-all draw in Paris, and, even more sensationally in Bordeaux, the French defeated a Welsh team containing Gus Risman, Jim Sullivan and the dual lion Jack Morley 18-11. By the end of its first season, the French Rugby League had 29 clubs. At the end of its second, it had 171, and by 1938 it had 434 clubs. The French Rugby Union banned players, officials and even grounds associated with the league. It played stodgy and politically dubious internationals against Germany, Italy and Romania, but these held little appeal for rugby fans. Even worse, French Rugby Union's affiliated clubs almost halved from 891 in 1924 to just 471 in 1939. The tide seemed to be turning in favour of rugby league. The crowning moment came in 1939. In February, France beat England 12-9 at St Helens, the first time that a French national side had won in England. And then 25,000 people crammed into Bordeaux's Stade Municipal at the end of the season to see France win their first ever European Championship with a 16-10 defeat of Wales. These rapid and almost revolutionary changes in French rugby reflected similar changes taking place in French society itself. The economic depression of the early 1930s had ushered in an era of acute political and social crisis. In May 1936, the Popular Front of Socialist and Liberal parties won the French general election, and a huge strike wave convulsed the nation. The fact that rugby league was challenging the established order of French rugby seemed to chime with the spirit of the Popular Front, and there could be no denying that the Popular Front government extended a helping hand to the rugby rebels. Leo Lagrange, the Socialist Minister for Sport, appeared as a guest of honour at the 1936 international match in Paris. Although Galia and his fellow Trezis stayed clear of politics, they became identified with the Popular Front, something that their enemies would not forget. 4 months after France's historic victory in the European Championship, on the 3rd of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and France was at war. In May 1940, the German army invaded and caused a spectacular collapse of the French nation, which was then divided into a German-controlled occupied zone in the north and an unoccupied zone controlled by Marshal Peytin's collaborationist government based in the town of Vichy. Under Pétain, France underwent a national revolution and pursued a policy of work, family and fatherland that reasserted right-wing France's traditional values. One of these values was a belief in amateur sports, and consequently the Vichy regime banned all professional sports. In theory, this ban covered sports such as soccer, but all other sports were allowed to continue on an amateur basis. Only rugby league was outlawed even in its amateur form. The Vichy Minister for Family and Youth was unequivocal. The fate of rugby league is clear. Its life is over and it will quite simply be deleted from French sport, he declared in August 1940. So, on the 10th of August 1940, the French Rugby League was informed that it was expected to help re-establish the unity of rugby. 3 days later, on a Sunday evening following the first matches of the 1940-41 season, an announcement was made on national radio by Commandant Joseph Jep Pasco, Vichy's Director of Sport. He declared that rugby league would be dissolved into the French Rugby Union. All of its assets, players and clubs were to be transferred to rugby union. But the ultimate responsibility for rugby league's fate lay in far more famous hands than those of Pasco. Jean Barotra, the bounding bass tennis player who won 5 Grand Slams in the 1920s, including 2 Wimbledon men's championships, had been appointed Vichy's Commissioner for General Education and Sports in July 1940. A youthful rugby player, Barotra oversaw Vichy sports policy until he left the country in 1942. A fervent believer in the amateur ethos of sport, it was he who gave Pasco the authority to delete rugby league. Interviewed shortly before his death in 1994, Barotra admitted his role in the ban to Mike Rylance. Pasco couldn't have done that without my authority, he confessed. Rugby league ended immediately with Pasco's announcement, but it would be another year before the decision would be signed into law. On the morning of the 19th of December 1941, Marshal Pétain issued a decree that was unique in the history of world sport. He announced that rugby à 13 had been banned by the government, its playing was to cease, its offices to be closed, and its assets confiscated by the government. The first point of the decree read, "The association known as the Ligue Française de Rugby à 13, whose headquarters are at 24 Drouot Street, Paris, is dissolved, authorisation having been refused it." Rugby league had become another victim of the Vichy regime's spirit of revanchism, or revenge. Pétain and his supporters wanted to settle their grievances against those they believed had taken France away from its rural, patriarchal and traditional past, whether they were communists, Jews, trade unionists, popular frontists or merely the liberal-minded. And in their long list of retribution they also included those who had rebelled against the authority of French Rugby Union. For men like Barotra and the leaders of French Rugby Union, who believed deeply in the amateur elite traditions of pre-World War I French rugby, the campaign against league was a necessity. But for Jep Pasco, it may have been something more. Pasco had been the fly half in the great Perpignan team that had won the French Championship in 1921 and 1925. Just days after his side lost the 1926 final against Toulouse, 7 Perpignan players were lured away by the offer of money from John Galia's Kian club, thus setting in train the revolution that would lead to the formation of rugby league. The Perpignan club was devastated and would not recover for a decade. For Pascoe and many others, Vichy's settling of scores with rugby league was not just ideological, it was personal. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my name is @CollinsTony, and if you want to dig a bit deeper into the history of rugby and the other football codes, take a look at the Rugby Reloaded website at www.rugbyreloaded.com.